The flashing lights in his rearview mirror made Judge Marcus Thompson's heart skip a beat. He'd been driving home after a long day in court, lost in thought about the cases he presided over. Now, seeing those red and blue lights, a chill ran down his spine. As a black man in America, even being a respected judge didn't guarantee safety from racial profiling. Judge Thompson carefully pulled over, his hands visibly on the steering wheel as he learned to do years ago. He took a deep breath, reminding himself to stay calm. The approaching footsteps seemed to echo in the quiet night air. "License and registration," barked a gruff voice. Judge Thompson turned slowly to face a white officer, his face set in a stern frown. "Sir, may I ask why I'm being pulled over?" the judge inquired politely. The officer's eyes narrowed. "You were swerving. Have you been drinking tonight?" Judge Thompson felt a mix of confusion and indignation rising within him. He knew he hadn't been drinking or swerving. Was this another case of driving while black? He'd heard countless stories from friends and colleagues about similar encounters. Now, it seemed it was his turn. "Officer, I assure you I haven't had a drop of alcohol. I'm coming home from work. I'm a judge at the county courthouse." He reached for his wallet, intending to show his credentials. "Keep your hands where I can see them," the officer shouted, his hand moving to rest on his holstered weapon. Judge Thompson froze, his heart racing. How had a routine drive home turned into this nightmare scenario? As tension filled the air, neither man moved. Judge Thompson's mind raced, thinking of all the similar situations he'd heard about in the news. Situations that had ended in tragedy. He knew he had to defuse this somehow, but how? In that moment, headlights appeared on the road behind them. Another car pulled up, and Judge Thompson heard a familiar voice call out, "Everything all right here, Officer Davis?" Relief washed over Judge Thompson as he recognized the voice of Sheriff Johnson, someone he'd worked with many times in court. But would the sheriff's presence help or complicate things? The officer turned, startled by the new arrival. "Just a routine traffic stop, Sheriff. Nothing to worry about." Sheriff Johnson approached, his experienced eyes taking in the scene. "Evening, Your Honor," he said, nodding to Judge Thompson. "Didn't expect to see you out here so late." The tension in the air shifted palpably. Officer Davis's eyes widened as he realized who he pulled over. Judge Thompson could almost see the wheels turning in the young officer's mind as he processed this new information. "Your Honor," Officer Davis repeated, his voice now uncertain. I didn't realize." Judge Thompson took a deep breath, weighing his next words carefully. This was a teachable moment, a chance to bridge a gap. But it was also a stark reminder of the biases that still plagued society, even in positions of authority. "Officer Davis," he began, his voice steady despite his racing heart, "I understand you're doing your job, but I hope you can understand why this situation is concerning to me." The officer shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Judge Thompson and Sheriff Johnson. The sheriff, sensing the delicacy of the moment, stepped in. "Why don't we all take a breath here? Judge Thompson, I know you're heading home after a long day. Officer Davis, maybe you'd like to explain your reasons for the stop." As the three men stood there on the side of the road, an important conversation began to unfold. It was a conversation about perception, about bias, about the experiences of Black Americans in encounters with law enforcement. It was a conversation that needed to happen, not just here on this dark stretch of road, but across the country. Judge Thompson found himself speaking not just as a judge, but as a black man, a father, a member of his community. He shared experiences he'd had, stories he'd heard from others. Officer Davis listened, at first defensive, but gradually becoming more open. "I never thought of it that way," the officer admitted at one point, his earlier bravado replaced by a thoughtful frown. "I mean, I don't consider myself racist, but maybe there are things I need to think about." As they talked, passing cars slowed, drivers curious about the unusual sight of a judge, a sheriff, and a patrol officer engaged in deep conversation by the roadside. Little did they know they were witnessing a moment that would have far-reaching consequences. What started as a routine traffic stop was turning into something much more significant. But how would it end? Would this encounter lead to real change, or would it be forgotten by morning? As the night wore on, the outcome remained uncertain, hanging in the balance like so many other moments in the ongoing struggle for equality and understanding. In the days and weeks to come, This roadside encounter would become a talking point in the community and beyond. It would spark discussions in homes, in schools, in police stations, and in courtrooms. But on that night, under the glow of streetlights and stars, three men from different walks of life were laying the groundwork for something powerful. As midnight approached, the conversation showed no signs of slowing down. Judge Thompson, Officer Davis, and Sheriff Johnson had stumbled into a pivotal moment, one that could potentially reshape their perspectives and impact countless others. But the night was far from over, and the most challenging part of their discussion was yet to come. The warm night air hummed with tension and possibility. Cars continued to pass by, their headlights briefly illuminating the three figures deep in conversation. Some drivers slowed down, curiosity piqued by the unusual scene. Little did they know they were witnessing a moment that could change their community forever. Judge Thompson's voice, usually commanding in the courtroom, now carried a note of vulnerability as he shared personal experiences. Officer Davis, his initial defensiveness melting away, listened with growing understanding. Sheriff Johnson mediated, his years of experience bridging the gap between law enforcement and the community proving invaluable. As the judge recounted a particularly harrowing experience from his youth, Officer Davis's face paled. I had no idea, he stammered. We're trained to look for suspicious behavior, but I never considered how that might feel from the other side. The conversation delved deeper, touching on systemic issues, personal biases, and the weight of history. It wasn't easy. There were moments of tension, of misunderstanding, of frustration. But there were also breakthrough moments of empathy and dawning awareness. You know, Sheriff Johnson said at one point, this conversation, it's something that needs to happen more often, not just here, but everywhere. Judge Thompson nodded, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. It's a start, he agreed. But where do we go from here? How do we turn this moment into real change? As they pondered this question, none of them realized that their roadside discussion was about to take an unexpected turn, one that would thrust their conversation into the national spotlight and force their community to confront long-ignored issues. The night was far from over, and the most challenging, and potentially transformative, part of their encounter was yet to come. As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, the three men stood at a crossroads, not just literally on that quiet stretch of road, but figuratively as well. The choices they would make in the coming hours would have repercussions far beyond anything they could imagine. What had started as a routine traffic stop had become something much more significant. But how would it end? Would this encounter lead to real change, or would it be forgotten by morning? As the night wore on, the outcome remained uncertain, hanging in the balance like so many other moments in the ongoing struggle for equality and understanding. The stage was set for a remarkable series of events that would challenge assumptions, spark heated debates, and potentially reshape the relationship between law enforcement and the community. But as Judge Thompson, Officer Davis, and Sheriff Johnson continued their discussion, none of them could have predicted the shocking turns their night was about to take. As the first rays of sunlight began to peek over the horizon, the three men were startled by the sudden appearance of flashing lights. A news van pulled up, its logo emblazoned on the side. A young reporter jumped out, camera in hand, clearly excited by the scene before her. Judge Thompson? Officer Davis? Sheriff Johnson? What's going on here? She called out, rushing towards them with her microphone extended. The men exchanged surprised glances. How had the media gotten wind of this late-night encounter? Sheriff Johnson stepped forward, his face a mask of calm professionalism. Now hold on there, he said, holding up a hand. This is a private conversation. We're not prepared to make any statements at this time. But the reporter wasn't backing down. Sources tell us that a prominent black judge was pulled over in what might be a case of racial profiling. Can you comment on that? Judge Thompson felt a wave of conflicting emotions wash over him. On one hand, he'd always been an advocate for transparency and accountability. On the other, he knew how easily a situation like this could be sensationalized, potentially undoing the progress they'd made in their hours-long conversation. Officer Davis looked visibly uncomfortable, his earlier openness replaced by a guarded expression. The fragile trust they'd been building seemed suddenly at risk. As more curious onlookers began to gather, drawn by the commotion, Judge Thompson made a split-second decision. "Ma'am," he addressed the reporter, his voice steady despite the turmoil he felt inside. What's happening here is important, but it's also complex. It's not something that can be summed up in a soundbite or a headline. The reporter's eyes lit up, sensing a story. Then help us understand, Your Honor. What exactly has been going on here all night? Sheriff Johnson and Officer Davis looked to Judge Thompson, silently deferring to his judgment. The judge took a deep breath, weighing his words carefully. What started as a routine traffic stop has turned into a profound discussion about race, law enforcement, and community relations, he began. It's been challenging, enlightening, and at times uncomfortable, but it's also been necessary. As Judge Thompson spoke, more media vans began to arrive. The quiet roadside was quickly transforming into an impromptu press conference. Officer Davis, who had been silent until now, stepped forward. I made some assumptions tonight, he admitted, his voice shaky but determined. Assumptions based on race. And Judge Thompson, along with Sheriff Johnson, have been helping me understand why that's problematic. A murmur ran through the growing crowd. This kind of frank admission from a police officer was rare, especially with cameras rolling. The reporter looked like she couldn't believe her luck. Officer Davis, are you saying you engaged in racial profiling? She pressed. Before Davis could respond, Judge Thompson interjected. What Officer Davis is saying is that he's willing to examine his actions and biases. That's something we all need to do, not just law enforcement. As the impromptu interview continued, the story began to take on a life of its own. Social media exploded with clips of the roadside conversation. Hashtags started trending. Hashtag roadside justice, hashtag honest conversations, hashtag policing and race. But while the world was watching this unexpected drama unfold, the three men at the center of it all were grappling with the implications of their newfound publicity. What had been a private, intense discussion was now playing out on a public stage. Sheriff Johnson pulled Judge Thompson and Officer Davis aside during a brief lull in the questioning. This is getting out of hand, he muttered. We need to think carefully about our next steps. Officer Davis nodded, looking overwhelmed. I never meant for this to become this, he gestured at the media circus around them. What if I lose my job over this? Judge Thompson felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. He'd initiated this conversation, pushed for honesty and introspection. Now he had to ensure that this moment led to positive change rather than more division. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the scene, more players entered the unfolding drama. The police chief arrived, looking stern and worried. Civil rights activists, hearing about the situation, began to gather with hastily made signs. Local politicians showed up, eager to be seen addressing the issue. What had started as a tense traffic stop had ballooned into a cultural moment, a flashpoint in the ongoing national conversation about race and policing. But would it lead to real change, or would it be just another fleeting media sensation? Judge Thompson knew that the next few hours would be crucial. How they handled this unexpected spotlight could set the tone for community relations for years to come. But he also knew that lasting change couldn't happen in the glare of cameras and the heat of the moment. As he prepared to address the growing crowd once more, Judge Thompson felt the weight of history on his shoulders. He thought of all the men and women who had fought for justice and equality before him. He thought of the countless Black Americans who had faced similar situations without the protection of a judge's robe or the happenstance of a sheriff's arrival. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice carrying across the now bustling roadside, what we've experienced here tonight, this morning, is just the beginning. It's a small step in a much longer journey. The cameras focused on him, the microphones leaned in, and a hush fell over the crowd. In living rooms across the country, people leaned towards their TV screens, sensing that they were about to witness something important. We've opened a dialogue here, Judge Thompson continued, but the real work is still ahead of us. Officer Davis has shown courage in acknowledging his biases. Sheriff Johnson has demonstrated leadership in facilitating this conversation, but it can't end here, on this roadside. He paused, looking out at the sea of faces before him, journalists, activists, curious bystanders, all hanging on his every word. In that moment, he knew that what he said next could change lives. I'm calling for a town hall meeting, he announced. Not just with law enforcement and judiciary, but with community members, educators, religious leaders. Everyone who has a stake in building a more just society, which is all of us. A ripple of excitement ran through the crowd. This was unexpected, bold, potentially revolutionary. But Judge Thompson held up a hand, tempering the growing enthusiasm. This meeting needs to happen away from cameras, away from the pressure of public performance. Real change, real understanding, it doesn't happen in sound bites. As murmurs of both approval and disappointment spread through the gathered crowd, Judge Thompson knew he was walking a tightrope. He was asking for trust from a community that had often found its trust betrayed. He was asking for vulnerability from institutions that typically prize strength and certainty. Would the community embrace this opportunity for dialogue? Would law enforcement be willing to engage in uncomfortable but necessary conversations? And how would this unexpected turn of events affect Officer Davis, whose simple traffic stop had inadvertently sparked a movement? As the morning sun climbed higher, casting its light on the impromptu gathering, the path forward remained uncertain. But one thing was clear: the events of this night had set something in motion, something that had the potential to reshape their community and perhaps even ripple out to affect the nation. The story was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. As the crowd dispersed and the media circus began to wind down, Judge Thompson, Officer Davis, and Sheriff Johnson found themselves at the center of a storm they never saw coming. The judge's call for a town hall meeting had set off a chain reaction throughout the community, igniting passionate debates in homes, workplaces, and social media feeds across the city. Officer Davis, still reeling from the night's events, returned to the police station to face his colleagues. The precinct was abuzz with whispered conversations that fell silent as he walked in. Some officers nodded in solidarity, while others averted their gaze. Davis could feel the weight of their judgment, but he also sensed something else: a grudging respect for his honesty. As he settled into his desk, his partner, Officer Rodriguez, approached. "That was a brave thing you did out there, Davis," she said quietly. "Not everyone sees it that way, but I do." Her words were a small comfort in the storm of uncertainty he now faced. Meanwhile, Judge Thompson was grappling with the consequences of his impromptu decision. His phone hadn't stopped ringing since he'd left the roadside. Colleagues from the bench, community leaders, and even national civil rights figures were all clamoring for his attention. As he listened to yet another voicemail, this one from a prominent Black Lives Matter activist, he couldn't help but wonder if he'd opened Pandora's box. Across town, in a modest home in a predominantly black neighborhood, Shanice Johnson watched the footage of the roadside encounter for the 10th time. As a young activist and law student, she saw this as a potential turning point for her community. But she also couldn't shake a nagging doubt. Would this really lead to change, or was it just another false promise? Shanice picked up her phone and dialed a number she knew by heart. "Grandpa," she said when the line connected, "have you seen the news? About Judge Thompson and that cop?" Her grandfather, Reverend Walter Johnson, a veteran of the civil rights movement, sighed heavily. "I've seen it, child. Reminds me of conversations we were having 50 years ago. The question is, will anything be different this time?" As night fell, Sheriff Johnson sat in his office, staring at a blank document on his computer screen. He was supposed to be drafting a statement about the incident, but the words wouldn't come. How could he encapsulate the complexity of what had transpired in a few sanitized paragraphs? His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. It was Deputy Chief Anderson, a hard-nosed veteran with a reputation for being by the book. "You've stirred up quite a hornet's nest, Tom," Anderson said, his face unreadable. "The mayor's office is breathing down my neck. They want to know how we're going to handle this." Sheriff Johnson leaned back in his chair, studying his old friend and colleague. "And what do you think, Bill? How should we handle it?" Anderson's stern expression softened slightly. "Off the record, I think you, Thompson, and that young officer might have started something important here, but it's going to be a hell of a tightrope walk." As the two men discussed the potential fallout and opportunities arising from the situation across town, a very different conversation was taking place. In a dimly lit bar, a group of off-duty officers gathered, their faces etched with concern and anger. "Davis threw us all under the bus," one grumbled, slamming his beer down on the table. "Now every traffic stop is going to be scrutinized. How are we supposed to do our jobs?" Another officer, older and more weathered, spoke up. "Maybe that's not such a bad thing," he said quietly. Maybe it's time we took a hard look at how we're doing things. The table fell silent, each officer lost in thought about what these changes might mean for their daily lives and the profession they dedicated themselves to. As the night deepened, the city seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what the morning would bring. The proposed town hall meeting loomed on the horizon, a beacon of hope for some, a source of apprehension for others. In his home office, Judge Thompson pored over reports of similar initiatives from other cities, searching for guidance on how to make this moment count. His wife, Dr. Evelyn Thompson, a respected sociologist, sat across from him, offering her insights. "Marcus," she said gently, noticing the fatigue in her husband's eyes, "you've opened a door here, but you can't control what comes through it. This is bigger than just one night, one traffic stop. It's about generations of pain and mistrust." The judge nodded, rubbing his temples. "I know, Evelyn. That's what scares me. What if we can't live up to the expectations we're setting? What if this just leads to more disappointment?" As dawn approached, Officer Davis tossed and turned in his bed, replaying the events of the past 24 hours in his mind. His phone buzzed with a text message. It was from his younger brother, a college student active in campus social justice movements. "Proud of you, bro. It's not easy to admit when you're wrong. Let me know if you want to talk." Davis stared at the message, a mix of emotions washing over him. He'd always been the good cop in his family's eyes, the one who was going to change things from the inside. Now, he wasn't sure where he stood or what his future in law enforcement looked like. As the first light of day began to creep over the horizon, the city stirred to life. News vans set up outside the courthouse and police station, eager for any updates. Social media buzzed with hashtags and heated debates. Community organizers mobilized, seeing an opportunity for long-awaited changes. But beneath the surface excitement, tension simmered. Some saw the upcoming town hall as a chance for genuine dialogue and progress. Others viewed it with suspicion, a performative gesture that would lead nowhere. And still others saw it as a threat to the status quo they desperately wanted to preserve. As Judge Thompson prepared to leave for work, knowing he'd face a barrage of questions and cameras, he paused at his front door. The weight of the moment settled on his shoulders. He knew that what happened next would define not just his career, but potentially the future of his community. With a deep breath, he stepped outside, ready to face whatever the day might bring. The stage was set for a confrontation that had been brewing for generations. But would it lead to meaningful change, or would history repeat itself once again? The city held its breath, waiting to see how this unfolding drama would play out. The day of the town hall meeting arrived, bringing with it a palpable tension that hung over the city like a storm cloud. The community center, chosen as a neutral ground for this crucial conversation, was surrounded by a sea of people hours before the doors were set to open. Supporters and skeptics alike gathered, their competing chants creating a cacophony of hope and frustration. Inside, Judge Thompson paced the empty auditorium, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. Each seat represented a voice that needed to be heard, a perspective that could shape the future of their community. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him, making each breath feel like a struggle. Across town, Officer Davis stood before his mirror, adjusting his uniform with trembling hands. He'd been given the option to attend in civilian clothes, but something in him refused to hide. This uniform was part of who he was, for better or worse. As he pinned his badge to his chest, he wondered if it would be for the last time. Meanwhile, Shanice Johnson and her grandfather, Reverend Walter, made their way through the growing crowd outside the community center. Shanice's eyes sparkled with determination, while the Reverend's face bore the wariness of a man who had seen too many false starts in the long march toward justice. "Remember, child," he said, squeezing her hand, "change doesn't come from one meeting. It comes from what we do every day after." As the doors finally opened, the crowd surged forward. Among them was Maria Hernandez, a local shop owner whose son had been arrested in a controversial stop-and-frisk incident last year. She clutched a photo of her boy, hoping that tonight might be the first step toward preventing other mothers from experiencing her pain. Sheriff Johnson stood at the entrance, greeting people as they filed in. His face was a mask of professional calm, but inside, his mind raced. He'd spent sleepless nights preparing for this moment, knowing that his words and actions could either build bridges or deepen divides. As the auditorium filled, the air grew thick with anticipation. Community leaders, activists, police officers, and everyday citizens found their seats, eyeing each other with a mix of curiosity and wariness. The diversity of the crowd was striking, a true cross-section of the city's population, all gathered under one roof. Backstage, Judge Thompson took a final deep breath before stepping out to the podium. The murmur of the crowd died down as he approached, all eyes turning to the man who had set this unprecedented event in motion. "Good evening," he began, his voice steady despite the butterflies in his stomach. "We gather here tonight not as adversaries, but as neighbors. We may not agree on everything, but we must agree on this. The status quo is not working, and it's up to us to change it." As Judge Thompson spoke, introducing the format for the evening, tensions in the room began to rise. Some nodded in agreement, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The real test would come when the floor opened for questions and statements from the community. Officer Davis, seated in the front row with other members of the police force, could feel the eyes of the crowd on him. He was no longer just Officer Davis, he had become a symbol, for better or worse. The first speaker approached the microphone. It was Maria Hernandez, her voice shaking as she held up the photo of her son. "My boy made a mistake, yes. But did he deserve to be treated like a criminal before he even did anything wrong? How many more of our children need to be traumatized before something changes?" Her words hung in the air, heavy with emotion. Officer Davis felt his chest tighten, recognizing in Maria's story echoes of the very biases he'd been forced to confront in himself. As more community members stepped up to share their experiences, the atmosphere in the room grew charged. Stories of racial profiling, excessive force, and systemic bias poured out, years of pent-up frustration and pain finding voice. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. Officer Davis stood up, making his way to the microphone. The room fell silent, all eyes on the man whose traffic stop had sparked this entire event. "I joined the force to protect and serve," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "But somewhere along the way, I lost sight of who I was protecting and serving. That night, when I pulled over Judge Thompson, I saw a black man in a nice car and made assumptions. I was wrong, and I'm here to say that's not okay." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some officers in the audience shifted uncomfortably, while others nodded in solemn agreement. Janice Johnson leaned forward, hardly daring to breathe. Was this the moment of accountability she'd been fighting for? But just as Officer Davis was about to continue, the doors at the back of the auditorium burst open. A group of protesters who had been denied entry due to space limitations pushed their way in, their angry chants drowning out the proceedings. "No justice, no peace," they shouted, waving signs and disrupting the carefully orchestrated meeting. Sheriff Johnson quickly moved to intercept the group, his hand instinctively moving to his weapon. The room held its collective breath, the tension ratcheting up to an almost unbearable level. Would this moment of potential understanding dissolve into chaos? Judge Thompson gripped the sides of the podium, his knuckles white. Everything they'd worked for hung in the balance. The next few moments would determine whether this town hall would be remembered as a turning point or just another failed attempt at reconciliation. As the protesters faced off against the police, with concerned citizens caught in the middle, the room crackled with the energy of centuries of mistrust and pain. It was a powder keg, and the slightest spark could set it off. In that charged moment, all eyes turned to Judge Thompson. His next words, his next actions, could either diffuse the situation or ignite a conflict that had been simmering for generations. The entire city seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see how this crucial moment would unfold. As the tension in the room reached a fever pitch, with protesters and police locked in a tense standoff, an unexpected voice cut through the chaos. "Stop, please, everyone, just stop and listen." The crowd parted, revealing Janice Johnson standing on a chair, her voice trembling but determined. All eyes turned to the young law student, her presence commanding attention in a way that surprised even her. "This is exactly what they want," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "They want us divided, fighting each other instead of addressing the real issues. But we're better than this. We have to be." The room fell silent, the protesters lowering their signs, the police relaxing their stances. In that moment of quiet, the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps echoed through the auditorium. Reverend Walter Johnson, Shanice's grandfather, made his way to the center of the room, his weathered face a map of a lifetime spent fighting for justice. "I've seen this before," he began, his voice soft but carrying to every corner of the room. "Moments of possibility crushed by fear and anger. But I've also seen what can happen when we choose to listen, to understand, to see the humanity in each other." As the Reverend spoke, a murmur of recognition spread through the crowd. Many knew him, or knew of him, a living link to the civil rights movement, a man who had marched with Dr. King. His presence seemed to shift the energy in the room, replacing anger with a tentative hope. Judge Thompson, sensing the moment, stepped away from the podium and into the crowd. "This is what we're here for," he said, looking around the room. "Not to point fingers or assign blame, but to really see each other, to understand the pain, the fear, and the hope that brings us all here tonight." But just as it seemed the crisis had been averted, a commotion near the back of the room drew everyone's attention. A group of officers was clustered around someone, their voices rising in alarm. As the crowd parted, gasps of shock rippled through the auditorium. There, collapsed on the floor, was Officer Davis. His face was pale, his breathing labored. "Call an ambulance," someone shouted, as Sheriff Johnson rushed to his side. In the chaos that followed, the lines that had divided the room moments ago seemed to blur. Protesters who had been shouting slogans now helped clear a path for the paramedics. Police officers who had been on edge found themselves working alongside community members to keep the crowd calm. As Davis was rushed to the hospital, the town hall stood at a crossroads. The dramatic turn of events had shattered the expected script, leaving everyone unsure of what would come next. Rumors began to circulate. Had the stress of the event triggered a heart attack? Was there something more sinister at play? Judge Thompson, along with Sheriff Johnson and Shanice, huddled together, trying to decide how to proceed. The eyes of the community, and now the nation, were upon them. How they handled the next few moments could determine the fate of their reform efforts. "We can't let this derail us," Shanice insisted, her earlier timidity replaced by a fierce determination. "Officer Davis put himself on the line tonight. We owe it to him, and to everyone here, to see this through." Sheriff Johnson nodded, his face etched with concern for his officer, but also with resolve. "She's right, but we need to be transparent about what's happening. No more closed doors, no more suspicion." As they debated their next steps, the mood in the auditorium shifted once again. The shared concern for Officer Davis had created an unexpected bond among the diverse groups present. Conversations that had been impossible an hour ago were now happening in hushed tones throughout the room. Maria Hernandez found herself comforting a young police cadet, both of them sharing their fears and hopes for the future. Reverend Johnson engaged in a deep discussion with the police chief, their decades of experience on opposite sides of the issue finding common ground in their desire for peace. Outside, news of the dramatic events had spread like wildfire. Social media exploded with conflicting reports and speculation. Crowds gathered outside the hospital where Davis had been taken, some holding candles, others demanding answers. As the night wore on, the town hall that had started with such promise descended into chaos, and then found an unexpected moment of unity, now stood at a precipice. The path forward was uncertain, fraught with potential pitfalls but also with the possibility of real, lasting change. Judge Thompson returned to the podium, the weight of the moment visible in every line of his face. The room fell silent once more, everyone waiting to hear what would come next. As he opened his mouth to speak, a collective intake of breath seemed to suspend time itself. In that charged moment, with the future of their community hanging in the balance, Judge Thompson prepared to make an announcement that would change everything. But what would he say? And how would it shape the ongoing struggle for justice and understanding that had brought them all to this point? The entire city, and now the watching world, held its breath, waiting to see how this unfolding drama would resolve. Judge Thompson took a deep breath, his gaze sweeping across the diverse faces before him. "Tonight," he began, his voice steady and clear, "we've witnessed the pain, anger, and fear that have divided our community for far too long. But we've also seen something extraordinary, a moment of unity born from shared concern for one of our own." He paused, allowing his words to sink in. "Officer Davis's condition is stable. The doctors believe it was a panic attack, brought on by the stress of this situation. But his courage in coming forward, in admitting his mistakes and committing to change, That's something we can all learn from. A murmur of relief rippled through the crowd. Judge Thompson continued, "In light of tonight's events, I'm announcing the formation of a Citizen Police Oversight Committee. This committee will have real power to review policies, to investigate complaints, and to recommend changes. It will be made up of community members, police officers, and legal experts working together to build the trust we so desperately need." The announcement was met with a mix of cautious optimism and skepticism. Shanice Johnson, sensing the moment, stepped forward. "Judge Thompson, if I may," she said, her voice carrying across the room. "This committee sounds like a step in the right direction, but how can we ensure it's not just another toothless gesture?" The judge nodded, acknowledging the valid concern. "An excellent question. That's why I'm also announcing that this committee will have the authority to recommend disciplinary actions, including termination, for officers found to have engaged in discriminatory practices. Additionally, we'll be implementing a new training program developed in partnership with community leaders and civil rights experts to address implicit bias and de-escalation techniques." A buzz of excitement filled the room. This was more than anyone had expected: real, concrete steps toward change. But Sheriff Johnson, standing at the back of the room, felt a knot forming in his stomach. He knew some of his officers would resist these changes fiercely. As if reading his mind, Judge Thompson addressed the law enforcement officers present. "I know these changes may seem daunting to some of you, but I believe they will make your jobs safer and more effective. By building trust with the community, we can create a city where everyone feels protected and served." Just as it seemed the night was drawing to a close on a note of hope, the doors burst open once again. A young officer, out of breath and wide-eyed, rushed to Sheriff Johnson. The two conferred urgently, their hushed voices drowned out by the murmur of the crowd. Sheriff Johnson's face paled. He made his way to the podium, whispering something to Judge Thompson. The judge's expression shifted from confusion to shock. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sheriff Johnson addressed the crowd, his voice grave, "I just received word that there's been a shooting at the hospital where Officer Davis was taken. Early reports suggest it may have been an attempt on his life." Gasps of shock echoed through the room. The fragile unity that had been building suddenly seemed on the verge of shattering. Accusations flew. Was it retaliation from angry protesters? A false flag operation by police to discredit the reform movement? The tension that had dissipated earlier came roaring back with a vengeance. In the midst of the chaos, Reverend Johnson's voice rang out. "Now is not the time for accusations. Now is the time to show what we're made of. If we turn on each other now, everything we've accomplished tonight will be for nothing." His words seemed to cut through the panic. Judge Thompson, regaining his composure, stepped forward. "The Reverend is right. We have a choice to make right now. Do we let this drive us apart, or do we stand together in the face of violence and fear?" Shanice, her eyes blazing with determination, joined them at the podium. "I say we go to the hospital, not as protesters or police, but as concerned citizens. Let's show the world what our community really stands for." A moment of silence fell over the room as her words sank in. Then, slowly at first, but with growing momentum, people began to move toward the doors. Police officers and community activists walked side by side, united in their concern for Officer Davis and their determination to not let violence derail their progress. As they filed out into the night, news cameras captured the extraordinary sight: a diverse group of citizens, many of whom had been at odds just hours before, marching together toward the hospital. Their faces showed resolve, concern, and a newfound sense of common purpose. Judge Thompson, walking alongside Sheriff Johnson and the Johnsons, felt a glimmer of hope. The path ahead was still uncertain, fraught with challenges and potential setbacks. But for the first time in a long while, it felt like real change might be possible. As they approached the hospital, surrounded by a sea of flashing lights and curious onlookers, the group steeled themselves for whatever they might find. The night had been full of unexpected twists, but this final challenge would truly test the strength of their newfound unity. With hearts pounding and breaths held, they stepped through the hospital doors, ready to face whatever came next, together. As the group entered the hospital, the atmosphere was tense. Nurses and doctors rushed past, barely sparing a glance at the unusual crowd filing through the doors. Sheriff Johnson took the lead, flashing his badge to get them past security and up to the floor where Officer Davis was being treated. When they reached the correct floor, they were met with an unexpected sight. Officer Davis was sitting up in his bed, looking shaken but very much alive. Beside him sat a young man, handcuffed to the chair, with two officers standing guard. "What's going on here?" Judge Thompson asked, his voice a mix of relief and confusion. Officer Davis looked up, his eyes widening at the sight of the diverse group crowding into his room. "It's not what you think," he said quickly. "This is Kevin. He came here to apologize." The young man, Kevin, spoke up, his voice trembling. "I was angry. I've been stopped by the police so many times, always for no reason. When I heard about what happened at the town hall, I thought I'd make a statement. But when I got here and saw Officer Davis, I just couldn't do it." A hush fell over the room as Kevin's words sank in. Janice stepped forward, her legal training kicking in. "Kevin, you don't have to say anything more without a lawyer present." But Kevin shook his head. "No, I need to say this. Officer Davis, when I came in here with that gun, I was ready to hurt you. But you looked at me and you said, 'I understand why you're angry. I'm sorry for every time I and my colleagues made you feel less than human.' And just like that, all my anger just deflated." Officer Davis nodded sullenly. "I meant every word. Tonight's town hall opened my eyes. I realized that every time I made an assumption based on someone's race, I was part of the problem. Kevin, I can't undo the past, but I promise you, I'm committed to doing better." The room was silent for a moment, the weight of the exchange hanging in the air. Then, surprisingly, it was Maria Hernandez who spoke up. "This is what real change looks like," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Not just policies and committees, but people really seeing and hearing each other." Judge Thompson stepped forward, addressing both Officer Davis and Kevin. "What happened here tonight is a microcosm of what we're trying to achieve in our community. It's not about erasing the past or pretending the pain doesn't exist. It's about acknowledging it, learning from it, and finding a way forward together." Reverend Johnson nodded in agreement. "Amen to that. But let's not forget, this is just the beginning. The real work starts now." Over the next few hours, as the night turned to dawn, the hospital room became an impromptu continuation of the town hall. People shared stories, asked questions, and really listened to each other, perhaps for the first time. The barriers that had seemed so insurmountable just hours ago began to crumble. As the sun rose, casting a warm glow through the hospital windows, Judge Thompson gathered everyone's attention. "What we witnessed here is extraordinary, but it can't end here. We need to take this spirit of understanding and cooperation back into our community." Sheriff Johnson stepped up beside him. "I commit, here and now, to implementing the changes we discussed at the town hall. The Citizen Police Oversight Committee will be established within the month. And I'm asking Officer Davis to lead our new training program on bias and community relations." Officer Davis, still in his hospital bed, looked stunned. "Me? But I'm the one who messed up in the first place." Janice smiled at him. "That's exactly why it should be you. You've shown that change is possible, that admitting mistakes and committing to do better is the first step toward real progress." As the group began to disperse, making plans to reconvene and continue the work they'd started, Kevin was led away by the officers. But before he left, Officer Davis called out to him, "Kevin, when you've served your time, come find me. I want to work with you to help bridge the gap between the police and the community." Kevin nodded, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "I'll do that, officer. Thank you." In the days and weeks that followed, the story of that night spread far beyond the city limits. National news outlets picked up the story, highlighting it as an example of how communities could address deep-seated issues of racial bias and police misconduct. The Citizen Police Oversight Committee was established as promised, with Janice Johnson as one of its key members. Officer Davis, after recovering from his health scare, threw himself into developing the new training program, often bringing in community members to share their experiences with police cadets. Maria Hernandez became a vocal advocate for police reform, working closely with Sheriff Johnson to implement community policing initiatives. Her son, inspired by the changes he saw, decided to pursue a career in law enforcement, determined to be part of the new generation of officers committed to serving all members of the community equally. Reverend Johnson, seeing the impact of that night, organized regular unity walks where police officers and community members would patrol neighborhoods together, getting to know each other as individuals rather than stereotypes. Judge Thompson, for his part, continued to use his position to push for systemic changes in the justice system, working to address the root causes of inequality and bias. But perhaps the most profound changes were the small, everyday interactions that began to shift. People who had once eyed each other with suspicion now greeted each other on the street. Community events saw a mix of attendees that would have been unthinkable just months before. Slowly but surely, trust began to build. It wasn't always easy. There were setbacks, moments of tension, and times when old habits threatened to resurface. But each time, the community remembered that night in the hospital, when they had seen the power of understanding and forgiveness. 1 year after that fateful traffic stop, the city gathered again for another town hall. This time, the atmosphere was different. There was still work to be done, challenges to overcome, but there was also a sense of hope, of progress made and bridges built. As Judge Thompson stood at the podium, looking out over the faces of his community, black, white, brown, police officers and civilians, young and old, he felt a surge of pride. "A year ago," he began, "we stood divided, unsure if we could ever find common ground. Today, we stand united, not because we've solved all our problems, but because we've committed to facing them together." The room erupted in applause, a celebration not just of what they had accomplished, but of the journey they were on together. As the cheers died down, Judge Thompson smiled. "Our work is far from over," he said. "But I believe that if we continue to approach each other with open hearts and minds, if we commit to justice and understanding, there's no challenge we can't overcome." As the town hall wrapped up, people lingered, chatting and making plans. Officer Davis, now a respected community liaison, stood with Kevin, who had recently been released and was working with a youth outreach program. Shanice and Sheriff Johnson discussed upcoming initiatives for the Oversight Committee. Maria Hernandez proudly watched her son, now in police academy, chatting with a group of veteran officers. And in that moment, it was clear that while the events of that night a year ago had been extraordinary, the real miracle was what had happened since, a community coming together, day by day, to build the kind of world they wanted to live in. It wasn't perfect, and there would always be more work to do, but they were on the right path, walking it together. As the last of the attendees filed out into the night, the sense of hope and possibility was palpable. The story of one traffic stop had become the catalyst for real, lasting change, and in communities across the nation, people were taking notice, wondering if they too could turn a moment of crisis into an opportunity for growth and reconciliation. The city had shown that change was possible, that understanding could triumph over fear, and that even the deepest divides could be bridged with compassion, commitment, and courage. As Judge Thompson locked up the community center, he smiled to himself. This wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of a new chapter.